In 1931, France built a passenger plane so bizarre, unstable, and terrifying, airlines refused to let it fly. Born from panic after a deadly crash, the Bleriot 125 promised perfect safety, then became aviation's strangest disaster. On March 23, 1928, a French Escad passenger aircraft crashed near Lyon after its single engine failed at roughly 2,000 feet. Witnesses watched the airplane suddenly lose stability, tilt sideways, and spiral toward the ground with absolutely no way to recover. Seconds later, it slammed into a field and killed everyone on board instantly. And just like that, commercial aviation in France stopped feeling modern and exciting. It started feeling dangerous. The newspapers made everything worse. Giant front-page headlines described terrified passengers, mechanical failure, and burning wreckage. Families panicked. Airlines started losing customers almost immediately. Investors quietly pulled money out of aviation companies, and government officials began demanding safer passenger aircraft before public trust completely collapsed. Suddenly, engine failure became the nightmare nobody could ignore. If one engine died in the air, the airplane usually died with it. And inside the Bleriot company, one engineer became obsessed with solving that problem forever. That engineer was Leon Kirste. Bald, intense, and completely convinced everybody else was thinking too small. After the crash panic spread across France, Bleriot executives gathered inside their Paris workshops, searching desperately for answers. The atmosphere was ugly, investors were nervous, airlines were scared, and then Kirste walked into the room carrying enormous blueprints that immediately made people stop talking. For a second, nobody even understood what they were looking at. The design showed a passenger aircraft with two complete fuselages connected by a giant central wing. Above that wing sat two engines mounted in tandem. One pulled from the front, the other pushed from the rear. Both shared the exact same thrust line. Kirste believed this would eliminate asymmetric thrust entirely. If one engine failed, the aircraft would theoretically remain stable instead of violently twisting sideways like traditional twin-engine planes. In 1928, that sounded revolutionary. To some engineers, it sounded brilliant. To others, it sounded like total insanity. But Kirste believed he had solved the deadliest problem in aviation. And this is where the story stopped feeling normal. Because the Bleriot 125 didn't resemble a passenger plane at all. It looked like something pulled from a science fiction magazine. The aircraft had two full wooden fuselages separated by 5.6 meters and connected through a massive central wing section. Suspended above the wing sat a giant nacelle containing two Hispano-Suiza 512 engines mounted one behind the other. One engine drove a tractor propeller in front. The second powered a pusher propeller behind it. Each fuselage carried 6 passengers inside luxury-style cabins with huge sliding panoramic windows. The cockpit sat high above the wing between the engines, and the crew had to crawl through internal wing corridors just to reach it. The tail looked equally bizarre, with 4 vertical fins connected by one huge horizontal stabilizer stretching across both fuselages. Even the landing gear looked strange, with tandem wheel arrangements partially hidden inside the body. Kirste even proposed converting it into a float plane later. Some people called it futuristic. Others called it a monster. Either way, nobody forgot seeing it. But behind the futuristic appearance, engineers immediately saw problems everywhere. The airplane looked enormous, heavy, and aerodynamically chaotic. Critics warned that the twin fuselage layout would create massive drag and dangerous airflow interference between the engines and wing surfaces. Others feared the tandem propellers would generate violent turbulence that pilots might struggle to control. Veteran aircraft designers openly mocked the entire concept before construction had even properly begun. And then, the construction problems started. The Bleriot 125 used an incredibly complicated wooden structure with giant internal spars, thick plywood skin, and maintenance corridors running through the wing itself. Workers struggled constantly during assembly. Some experienced carpenters reportedly quit after realizing how difficult the aircraft was becoming to build correctly. Rumors spread across Paris cafes that Bleriot had gone completely insane. People joked the company was no longer building airplanes. It was building experiments for lunatics. And the craziest part? The aircraft still hadn't even flown yet. In late 1930, the Bleriot 125 appeared publicly for the first time at the Paris Air Salon. And honestly, the reaction was brutal. Visitors walked through rows of sleek modern monoplanes and elegant commercial aircraft before suddenly stopping in confusion at the Bleriot stand. The airplane looked gigantic, awkward, and completely unnatural beside everything around it. Some people stared silently, others laughed immediately. Children pointed at it and called it a monster. The press absolutely destroyed it. Journalists described the aircraft as two airplanes tied together by a madman. British reporters mocked French aviation openly, suggesting the industry had completely lost its mind. Some newspapers compared the aircraft to a flying building instead of an airliner. Competitors from rival manufacturers quietly watched the chaos with smiles on their faces. And this is what made the situation dangerous for Bleriot. Public opinion had already turned against the aircraft before it ever left the ground. Meanwhile, the company had already invested enormous amounts of money into making the impossible machine fly. By the spring of 1931, the Bleriot 125 finally rolled onto the runway at Villers-Cotterêts for its first serious taxi tests. Mechanics lined both sides of the airfield, watching nervously as the two Hispano-Suiza engines fired up in tandem. At first, things actually looked promising. The aircraft moved slowly across the runway with surprising stability, and for a brief moment, some engineers thought maybe Kirste had proven everyone wrong after all. But then the speed increased, and almost immediately, the entire airplane began shaking violently. Vibrations surged through the giant wooden structure so hard that both fuselages visibly trembled while accelerating down the runway. The strange tandem landing gear started transmitting shocks directly into the airframe, creating a deep mechanical shudder that mechanics could physically feel standing nearby. Some quietly stepped backward without even realizing it. And near the edge of the runway, Leon Kirste stood silently with his arms crossed, staring at the aircraft without saying a word. Because deep down, everybody could feel it now. The Bleriot 125 already seemed unstable before it had even left the ground.
He eventually completed it in exactly the same time as Bleriot's original flight.
And then came June 1931, the moment that would either save the project or completely destroy it. Test pilot Henri Lecomte arrived early that morning to prepare for the aircraft's first true takeoff attempt, but even reaching the cockpit felt absurd. Instead of climbing directly into the flight deck like a normal airplane, Lecomte had to crawl through narrow internal corridors running inside the wing itself just to reach the central nacelle above the aircraft. The process reportedly took several minutes, and people immediately started asking the obvious question: if it took this long during a calm test flight, what happened during an emergency? Then the engines roared to life. The sound echoed across the airfield, unlike anything mechanics had heard before. The giant aircraft began accelerating slowly down the runway, struggling to build speed under its own massive weight. For a second, it almost looked stable, and then everything went wrong. Halfway through the takeoff run, the rear engine transmission suddenly failed. The rear propeller rapidly lost power while the front propeller continued pulling at full thrust. Instantly, the aircraft lurched violently to the right as an asymmetric force ripped through the airframe. The exact problem Kirste claimed his design would eliminate forever had just appeared in front of everyone watching. LeConte slammed both engines down and aborted the takeoff immediately. The aircraft skidded toward the end of the runway before finally stopping near soft ground, where part of the landing gear partially collapsed into the dirt. Mechanics sprinted toward the aircraft while Kirste walked silently behind them, staring directly at the failed rear engine. Later investigation revealed the cause: severe vibration damage inside the gearbox transmission system. The aircraft failed because of the very problem it was designed to prevent. The repairs took 6 exhausting weeks. Replacement gearbox parts had to be manufactured, structural reinforcements added, and the engine transmission system redesigned again. But while Bleriot tried keeping the incident quiet, the story leaked into French newspapers anyway. Journalists immediately turned the aircraft into a national joke. One headline called it "the two-headed monster that cannot fly." And honestly, the public loved mocking it. In September 1931, the aircraft attempted another flight. This time it actually left the ground, but only for around 40 terrifying seconds before LeConte aborted the test after encountering violent lateral oscillations he struggled to control properly. Later that evening, he handed engineers a handwritten 3-page report listing problem after problem. Visibility from the cockpit was terrible because the giant wing blocked major sections of his view. The controls responded slowly. The aircraft felt delayed and unstable. And this is where things became desperate. Throughout the winter of 1931, engineers redesigned tail surfaces, reinforced structural joints, installed modified propellers, and kept pouring money into the aircraft while financial pressure inside Bleriot kept growing. Then finally, in March 1932, the Bleriot 125 completed its first real flight lasting 22 minutes. But even that success felt wrong. The aircraft turned sluggishly. The cockpit became unbearably hot from the engines surrounding it. The tandem propellers created so much noise that pilots could barely communicate with each other. And after landing, LeConte delivered the line that quietly killed the project forever. "The plane flies, but flying isn't enough." And this is where the Bleriot 125 stopped being merely strange and started becoming genuinely feared. No airline wanted it, not one. Air France officially rejected even evaluating the aircraft for future operations, and smaller carriers quietly avoided the project altogether. Because by this point, the test reports sounded terrifying. The airplane suffered from instability problems, sluggish controls, dangerous low-speed handling, overwhelming cockpit noise, and severe overheating inside the central nacelle. Even reaching the cockpit during emergencies looked like a nightmare. But the real fear came from the oscillation incidents during testing. In one evaluation flight, the aircraft entered a dangerous rhythmic lateral instability that took LeConte nearly 2 full minutes to recover from by increasing speed carefully. Imagine being a passenger on board while even France's most experienced test pilot struggled to regain control of the machine. That image alone destroyed confidence in the aircraft. Technically, the Bleriot 125 was never officially banned, but in reality, it didn't matter. Airlines refused to buy it, regulators refused to certify it, pilots didn't trust it, investors feared it. The aviation world had become afraid of the aircraft itself. By late 1932, the project was financially collapsing. The Bleriot 125 had already consumed roughly double its original budget, while banks started demanding explanations the company could no longer give. Suppliers waited for unpaid invoices, employees faced delayed salaries, investors quietly lost patience. And with airlines refusing contracts, the company suddenly found itself trapped inside a disaster it could no longer afford to continue. That autumn, the project was officially abandoned. Witnesses later described Leon Kirste looking exhausted and aged beyond recognition during the final meetings. His revolutionary aircraft, the machine he believed would save commercial aviation, was now considered a hopeless failure. Soon afterward, workers began stripping the aircraft apart for reusable components. The engines were removed and reportedly resold. Valuable equipment disappeared piece by piece. For many mechanics, the dismantling felt brutal. Some became emotional watching the aircraft destroyed after spending years building it. Others were simply angry that so much effort and money had been wasted on something that never truly worked. Then, in January 1934, the final order came. The Bleriot 125 was chopped apart with saws and axes inside the hangar. Wood burned, metal was melted into scrap. Within days, the aircraft had completely vanished. Almost nothing survives today. After the collapse, Leon Kirste almost disappeared from aviation history completely. Meanwhile, the Bleriot company suffered enormous reputational damage from the project's failure. Looking back later, engineers realized something uncomfortable. The core idea actually sounded brilliant on paper. Eliminating asymmetric thrust made logical sense, but in reality, the aircraft became an aerodynamic nightmare filled with airflow interference, structural weight problems, instability, and terrible cockpit accessibility. And while the Bleriot 125 collapsed, conventional twin-engine aircraft quietly evolved into safer and far more practical passenger planes anyway. Simpler designs ultimately solved the same safety concerns without creating flying monsters in the process. Today, the aircraft survives mostly as a symbol, a warning about ambition without practicality. Innovation pushed beyond reason, because sometimes the future arrives too early. And sometimes, it simply arrives broken. Today, the Bleriot 125 survives only in blurry photographs and forgotten technical drawings. No museum preserved it. No airline wanted it. And yet decades later, aviation historians still stare at this impossible machine asking the same question. How did anyone seriously believe this terrifying thing would ever fly?